Hey, how's it going, everybody? Matt Houston here, and today we're going to talk about how much I think healing in 5th edition D&D sucks. It doesn't say that healing in terms of healing magic actually isn't very good. I think it's actually in a very perfect spot. It's okay and decent if you don't have a healing archetype, but if you pick a healing archetype, something such as the Life Cleric, where you get to really boost the amount of healing that you give, or the Druid, where you get to just have extra abilities that provide healing to the party, you are a very good healer at that point. And I think those are set up in very good ways. But specifically, the rules around resting need some work. Being able to just take 8 hours rest and be at full hit points, considering the fact that most people don't even talk about prep time for, clerics or wizards to prepare their spells effectively, the proper maintenance for their weapons, etc. All these things are kind of brushed under the rug and left to the wind, as opposed to previous editions. So we're going to look at some variant rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, see what they kind of give us. In addition, we can look at some older editions of D&D to see if maybe we can come up with some ideas to really spice things up a little bit more. So how does healing work in 5th edition? Well, it works like this. You spend a day adventuring, you're down most of your spell slots on your spellcasters, most of your abilities for other classes that have resources such as key points for monks, or maneuvers for a certain kind of fighter are mostly gone. You have a few left just in case something attacks you at night. Nothing does. You manage to hide in Leomund's tiny hut, for example. Leomund's tiny hut conveniently lasts 8 hours. So unless you have something conveniently waiting just outside the dome and you don't start your long rest immediately after casting, you have a small window where the DM could surprise you. And in older editions, that would actually be capitalized on by DMs. You have a very specific window in which you can disrupt their long rest, but the players can be ready for it. So, you're safe inside the hut, you spend your 8 hours, congratulations, you now have full hit points, you remove most conditions, if you had any, reduce your exhaustion level by 1 if you had any, you recover all spell slots, all your resources come back, and if you had less than half your hit dice, you get half of them back with that little deficit, but odds are you had most of your hit dice anyways. This means that your party can just take a day inside the dungeon. Rations are relatively cheap and can be made with a casting of a very low level spell. Water, same thing. Especially once you hit 5th level and you have a wizard who can cast Leomund's tiny hut. Where is the risk in resting a day? Unless you have given the party a specific timeline that them resting can become problematic, resting inside of a day becomes a trivial matter. If you have a party with a monk and a warlock, taking a short rest is absolutely insanely good, and you get a lot back by doing that. Not only can you heal most of your hit points if you need to, but you can also get most of your resources back. So let's look at some variant rules that the Dungeon Master's Guide provides that we can expand on these rule sets a little bit and possibly make things a little harder, or in some cases, even easier. So the healing variant rules start on page 266 of your Dungeon Master's Guide, and we have 3 major options: Healer's Kit Dependency, Healing Surge, and Slow Natural Healing. Healer's Kit Dependency. A character can't spend any hit dice after finishing a short rest until someone expends 1 use of their healer's kit to bandage and treat their wounds. Now, this sounds like a minor irritation when you gotta consider, hey, we have to spend healer's kits, which, by the way, if you don't get healer's kits with you anyways, you're playing the game wrong, according to a lot of players, because being able to just immediately stabilize someone for a use of a healer kit, which has 10 charges, is really good. Healer's kits are relatively cheap for what they do. To ensure that you're able to spend hit dice to heal on a short rest, having to have a healer's kit, and I want to be clear here, the healer's feat is also just really good anyways. Odds are pretty good that someone in your party has a bag of holding or a haversack or some sort of equivalent where you can kind of just stuff a bunch of garbage that you have or a lot or things in bulk and just throw them in the haversack. If you have 2 healer's kits into the bag just for hit dice, that's 20 charges. That's 20 times a character can expend hit dice during a short rest to heal up. This does prevent characters from abusing the short rest mechanic where they can kind of just always be at max hit points, so assuming that they're not on any major time constraints. I personally kind of like this. I'm okay with short resting being a mechanic. I actually think it's very creative. I think it's very good for the game, letting you kind of stop and catch your breath. I think it's a little too powerful, personally. I think being able to just restore yourself to full hit points whenever you damn well please, especially if you have a bard in the party, which heals you even further. Healing surges. This optional rule allows characters to heal up in the thick of combat and works well for parties with few features or no characters with healing magic, or for campaigns in which magical healing is rare. As an action, a character can use a healing surge and spend up to half his or her hit dice. For each hit dice spent this way, the player rolls the die and adds their character's constitution modifier. This character regains hit points equal to that total. The player can decide to spend an additional hit dice after each roll. Character uses healing surge can't do so again until he or she finishes a short or long rest. Under this optional rule, a character regains all spent hit dice at the end of a long rest. With a short rest, a character regains hit dice equal to his or her level divided by 4, so 1/4. For more superhero feel, you can let a character use Healing Surge as a bonus action rather than an action. So this pushes it in the other direction of even more healing. Now, it does say very specifically that this is designed for a fighter-heavy campaign or a rogue-heavy campaign. A campaign in which you have very minimal healing in the party through magical means. And you don't want to have to give your party a massive gold deficit by forcing them to spend money on healing potions. I actually think this is a perfectly viable rule to use for the hit dice. I don't know about having them recover a quarter of their hit dice at a short rest. That feels like it's just a little too much and a little too complicated. Plus, having 1 or 2 additional hit dice, sometimes 3 in late levels, is not really going to be a big defining amount. So I would actually just axe it and just give them full hit dice at the end of a long rest and just call it a day. Personally, I would not use this. I would just allow for some additional ways of healing, such as finding an extra couple healing potions here and there, or forcing the players to be in a position where they have to consider their options carefully. This is where I think the long rest mechanic actually works really, really well, is when you don't have healing magic to supplement against it. And lastly, slow natural healing. Characters don't regain hit points at the end of a long rest. Instead, a character can spend hit dice to heal at the end of a long rest just as they would a short rest. This option rule prolongs the amount of time the character needs to recover from their wounds without the benefit of magical healing, and works well for grittier, more realistic campaigns. Now, to add to this, you still recover half your hit dice at the end of a long rest. It doesn't say which order that you do it in this variant rule, but I would say that it's after you've healed. This forces you to spend your hit dice carefully and does force players to use spells on healing. If you're more familiar with older versions of D&D, you would recover hit points very slowly, and you would actually have significant amounts of downtime, usually a week, sometimes more, just to make sure that your wounds are recovered. This, of course, can be supplemented with healing magic. This causes you to consider your hit dice to be much more heavy of a resource. There are 2 rest variant rules. I know it kind of sounds like we had resting variant rules, especially with the last one, but this one is very specific around the resting mechanics. And they are Epic Heroism and Gritty Realism. Epic Heroism reads as follows. This variant rule uses a short rest for 5 minutes and a long rest for an hour. This change makes combat more routine since characters can easily recover from every battle. You might want to make combat encounters more difficult to compensate. Spellcasters using the system can afford to burn through spell slots quickly, especially at higher levels. Consider allowing spellcasters to restore expended spell slots only equal to half their maximum spell slots, rounded down, at the end of a long rest, and to limit spell slots restored to 5th level or lower. Only full 8-hour rests will allow spellcasters to restore all spell slots and regain all slots above 6th level or higher. This just turns the healing and amount of constant combat to the maximum. This really benefits non-spellcasters, of course, and it does allow you to just burn through 5th level and lower spells like crazy, and then forces your players into a position where they have to long rest for the big magic. The problem I have with this is that it does something, which is it separates spellcasters from martial characters in a way that I don't really like. It forces you in a position where you kind of want to just pick classes that recover on short rests and have additional healing off of short rests, because there are ways to do that, and because you can just constantly sit down for 5 minutes and have healing magic, abilities, spell casting, if you're in the case of the warlock, back off of a short rest every 5 minutes. This is really great if you want to play those 20 plus level characters where, you're fighting a war of the gods or something like that, where fighting on the front or having to be constantly pushing past enemy lines where you're essentially a demigod yourself. This sort of ruling makes a lot of sense to have. Your power, it would be just so overflowing, you just simply stop and rest for a moment and everything is fine. This, of course, is on the opposite end of the spectrum of what I personally like, but it is very good on certain niche scenarios, and I actually kind of like the rules that they have here for. Gritty Realism. This variant uses short rests of 8 hours and long rests of 7 days. This puts the brakes on the campaign, requiring the player to carefully judge the benefits and drawbacks of combat. Characters can't afford to engage in too many battles in a row, and all adventuring requires careful planning. This approach encourages the characters to spend time out of the dungeon. This is a good option for campaigns that emphasize intrigue, politics, and interactions among NPCs, and in which combat is rare or sometimes to be avoided rather than rushed into. This feels a lot more like old school D&D. Take 3.5 for example, which is one I played a lot in. You recovered your level plus your constitution modifier in hit points for, essentially what would have been a long rest. Meaning you spent a significant amount of time down at the inn after you delved into a dungeon because you're probably hurt pretty bad. It's also forced a lot of clerics and anyone really who had the healing spells to expend spells to heal the party to keep them going. Now, personally, I think this is a little bit on the extreme side. I wouldn't make people spend a week of downtime just to get their hit dice back or their spell slots back or anything like that. I would use a variation of this variant rule, as silly as that sounds. And during a short rest, you recover your level plus your constitution modifier during a short rest. You get a little bit of healing. Short rests are reduced to half an hour from an hour. I think an hour is a little long. Next, long rests are still 8 hours, but you do not recover full hit points. You need to spend hit dice to recover. You get half of your hit dice back if you spend a day not in combat. This generally occurs when you're traveling in between adventures and you're on a cart or you're just walking through the woods. You recover half your hit dice at the end of a long rest. Or, you have some downtime and you recover your hit points this way. At the end of a long rest, you would do as follows. Spend hit dice and recover hit points, adding your constitution modifier per die roll, then recover your hit dice. The reason I like this personally is that it doesn't allow your party to constantly long rest through a dungeon. There is a cost associated with it. Now, after a pretty gritty and heavy combat, you do need to take a long rest, and I would absolutely expect certain players to do so. Much like as the Dungeon Master's Guide suggests with certain rules, this does make the game a little bit grittier, meaning that you have to take more consideration into your actions as you go through a dungeon. That forces you to make more planning. This also forces you in a position where if you need to take a long rest, you have to take a long rest. But this also means that you can't be taking long rest after long rest after long rest, because you will not have the hit dice to sustain it. Also, spending a day inside a dungeon, as in spending 24 hours inside a dungeon in order to regain hit dice, can be very risky, as there are usually monsters that patrol the area. The Dungeon Master might just throw something at you just so that you don't recover hit points because you've been in combat. Overall, I think 5th edition allows for a very simplistic version of D&D. It allows for new players to join the game very easily. Play whatever rules that you like yourself. Maybe healing isn't good enough and you think that you need the epic heroism. Heal on a short rest every 5 minutes and the long rest is 1 hour. So you can just gallivant your way through every single combat constantly. Maybe that's your style. There is no right or wrong way between these. But personally, I think healing in 5th edition is dumb. So that just about ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. Do leave a comment in the Troll's Nest on the underside of this video and tell me, what do you think of healing in 5th edition, specifically around the resting mechanic? Don't worry about healing spells too much. I have my own gripe with the way that healing spells and death saving throws and all that work. Do like this video if you did. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss another video. And until next time, guys, have a nice day.